Time now for the big question, where you get to quiz top celebrities, public figures, decision makers and sports people via GB Views. And my guest tonight is one of the most famous human rights campaigners in the world, having dedicated 54 years of his life to securing freedom and equality for all, at a cost to his health, his reputation and his personal safety. Known for stunts including hijacking the Archbishop of Canterbury's Easter service in 1998 to advocate for LGBT rights, and his attempted citizen's arrest of Robert Mugabe over human rights abuses in Zimbabwe, Peter Tatchell's controversial but impactful and effective methods have recently been celebrated in the Netflix documentary Hating Peter Tatchell, executive produced by Sir Elton John and David Furnish. Have a look.
What keeps me going is the knowledge that the homophobes who are against me want me to give up. Just like the suffragettes or the black civil rights movement in America, we have to get a bit angry and confrontational. We've tried to play by the rules, it hasn't worked, now we're going to break the rules.
Now, while other so-called social justice warriors cancel people for misgendering others and fight for content warnings on kids' films, Peter stands apart by targeting tyrants and bad actors in countries where marginalised groups face persecution and death, as opposed to hurt feelings. Despite having received brain damage after being beaten by neo-Nazis during a previous protest in Moscow, Peter travelled to Russia during the 2018 World Cup to covertly campaign against LGBT oppression in the country and anti-gay purges in Chechnya. Now, after 3,000 non-violent protests, 100 arrests, 300 violent assaults and thousands of death threats, he's turning his attention to the tournament's next host country. His mission: encourage Qatar to liberalise by highlighting homophobia, denial of women's rights, exploitation of migrant labour and other human rights abuses in the Arab state when the world's eyes turn there next year. And Peter joins me now. Well, Peter, Hating Peter Tatchell is an incredible documentary. It's absolutely sensational. And while there are many political points that I disagree with you on, I just have so much respect for the fact that you have been prepared through your entire life to put yourself in the most dangerous positions and actually to do all of the things that I very often ask protesters back home to do, you know, to look to China, to look to Russia, to look to the Middle East, to look to countries like Zimbabwe, and you've done it. So it's a fascinating documentary and I really recommend that people watch it. But I just wanted to kick off by talking to you about Qatar, Peter Tatchell, because of course we've seen all of these protests, anti-racism protests, the taking of the knee at the recent Euros tournament, and people have different views on that, but no one in the football fraternity seems to have any issue of the fact that the World Cup is about to be played in this tyrannical country next year.
Well, absolutely. Qatar is not a democracy. It does not respect human rights. There's little or no redress for people who are victims of persecution and discrimination. With regard to same-sex relations, having gay sex can get you 7 years in prison. And if you're a Muslim, you can even risk being put to death simply for having a same-sex relationship. We know that over 6,500 migrant workers, mostly from South Asia, countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, India, and so on, have died in Qatar since the country was granted the World Cup. And a lot of them have died working on projects building stadiums because health and safety regulations have been so lax, and because they are required to work in extremely high heat conditions, which very often can lead to exhaustion and even heart failure. On top of that, of course, women have all kinds of controls upon them. They're required to get a male guardian's permission to travel, to marry, to work, to have education, to have control over decisions about their own children. And of course, Qatar claims that this is not actually written in law, but the reality is that is what actually happens
No,
in
indeed.
practice.
And I hear you on all of that, and it's despicable. So do you think that these England players will be hypocrites if they claim to be social justice warriors, but then go and play in this tournament?
But I think, first of all, Qatar should have never been granted the World
Agree.
Cup.
I agree.
Not just because of its human rights record and its labour relations record, but because there are big questions about whether that decision was the result of corruption and bribes.
Big questions,
So
indeed.
there's a whole lot of questions here.
I know, and I completely agree with you there. But it's being hosted there now. So what should the England team do? Because we saw Gareth Southgate and all of his players. They want to be social justice warriors. How can they go and play in Qatar in all good conscience?
Well, I wouldn't call them social justice warriors. I'd say they were trying to be respectful and honour the often dreadful experience that black people have suffered in this country. But that issue aside, I'm not necessarily in favour of an England boycott. I think that players should go there, but they should do some kind of symbolic gesture and protest to show that they are on the side of democracy and human rights. And this may be wearing some symbol. It may be by making public statements. There's a whole raft of different things that English players and indeed fans could do. And I think that would be probably far more effective than actual boycott.
And you put yourself at great risk in 2018 protesting the Russia World Cup. Will you be planning on trying to go to Qatar next year?
Well, that's certainly on my radar, but I think probably I don't want to give the Qataris too much advance notice. So I'm sort of playing that close to my chest for the moment. But definitely, there needs to be a calling out of Qatar over its human rights abuses. One of the things I've discovered in my research is that Qatar has secret, basically gay re-education camps where people who are gay are forced or pressured to go into these re-education centres where they practice a form of conversion therapy to try and make them straight. This is all very, very hush-hush. Most Qataris don't know it exists. The outside world doesn't know it exists. But it's an horrific example of the way in which LGBT plus people suffer serious persecution and attempts to change their sexuality or gender identity by government-funded agencies and centres.
But Peter, what drives you personally to keep doing this? Because watching the documentary, you see the toll it's taken on your life in so many ways, but including brain damage, permanent brain damage as a result of those vicious and violent attacks that you've suffered over the years.
Well, as hopefully you can see, the brain damage is not that severe, but it does cause some level of disability. But I'm coping. What drives me is simply a love of other people. I love other people. I love freedom, justice, and equality, and I want to see that for everyone. When I see someone suffering, I really loathe it. I don't like to see people suffering. I say to myself, if I was suffering, I would want someone to help me. So surely when I see others suffering, I should try and do my bit to help them. And I think if we all did that, we'd live in a much kinder, gentler and better world.
But Peter, you're also a great defender of free speech and freedom of expression. And I know you're very concerned about this move, and some people would call it a woke culture, or some people would call it a cancel culture, but whatever you call it, that this move in democratic societies, here in the UK, to start censoring folk who have so-called disagreeable views that might go against the woke orthodoxy. I mean, J.K. Rowling is one, for example.
Well, I think that cancel culture is justified in extreme circumstances if, like, for example, a far-right person or somebody else is advocating violence against other human beings. That is not free speech. That's an abuse of free speech. And in fact, it's a criminal offence. So people in those kind of situations should be banned. But otherwise, even if people hold views that I disagree with, I defend their right to hold them, and I will challenge them. I will protest them. and I'll happily debate them in my attempt to show why they're wrong. I'll give you an example. Not long ago, a street preacher, Pastor Alan Sherwood in West London, was arrested by the police for criticizing homosexuality. Obviously, I totally disagree with him, but I thought it was outrageous that he should be arrested for expressing a view in a calm, non-threatening, non-inflammatory way. And I've actually said I am prepared to go to court to testify in his defense because
Wow.
as much as I disagree with him, he has a right to his free speech.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that's a very brave position to take. Now, look, tell me about the Netflix documentary, because it's obviously given you this whole new audience. Lots of people talking about you, Peter. It's so well produced. Ian McKellen, he obviously features interviewing you, but Elton John and David Furnish, executive producers, how did they get involved? Have you known them for a long time? What's the story of their involvement?
Yeah, I have known them for a long time, and that they very strongly support the human rights work that I do. When the director, Christopher Amos, began making the film, he did a little sort of rough trailer to start with and sent it off to David Furnish. He was so impressed that he said, I want to come on board and help with this film. So that's how Elton and David became executive producers. And it really has helped give the film a push. One of the things that really has been really positive in terms of feedback is that so many people have said to me, wow, I never knew you'd been campaigning for 54 years, and I never knew the range of issues you campaign on. A lot of people just think that I'm an LGBT plus gay rights campaigner, but I'm much, much more than that. I stand for a fair deal for everybody. I don't care who you are, you deserve a fair deal. You deserve freedom. You deserve respect. And that's been the raison d'etre of my campaigning over these last 5 decades.
And you're prepared to take everyone on, whether it be Putin or Mugabe or even Mike Tyson, Peter Tatchell. But look, we've got floods of questions coming in from our brilliant viewers. So I want to get to them because they have far better questions than me, Peter. I really can tell you that. So Faye, via the GBNews Twitter account, he asks, have human rights been abused to the point that criminals' rights now supersede victims?
I don't think so. I think there are some sensational examples that are given a lot of publicity, but it is not the norm. I agree that people who commit crimes should pay the price, but we should also encourage and educate them to reform, to give up their criminal ways. So I'm a great believer in redemption. When it comes to fighting homophobia, for example, I always hold out an olive branch to hope that people will change. You remember back in the 1990s, Michael Patillo, who was then Defense Secretary, was witch hunting gay and bisexual men out of the armed forces. I challenged him remorselessly. I protested against him. Some people even say I harassed him to stop his homophobia. And eventually, over time, he did. And when he did, when he began to switch from supporting discrimination to supporting equality, I wrote to Michael Patillo and thanked him. Because, for me, I want enemies to be friends. I don't believe that once you've made a mistake or once you've done a bad thing, you should be cancelled. I think we need to hold out the option of forgiveness and redemption for everyone who turns over a new leaf.
OK, great answer. Ryan on Twitter asks, what right does a person have to refuse asylum in dozens of safe countries so they can instead make their way to the UK? How does that make them a refugee still and not an economic migrant? So Ryan, obviously referring at the moment to the situation on the English Channel.
But of course, a lot of the refugees who come across the Channel have connections with the UK. Many of them have family here. Others speak English. They don't speak French or German. So it obviously makes sense that they would want to come to Britain rather than these other non-English speaking countries. The other thing I'd say is that over the last 30, 40 years, I've helped probably close to 1,000 people secure asylum. And I can tell you that every one of them has had skills and talents that Britain needs. doctors, plumbers, carpenters, electricians, teachers, psychologists, a whole range of different occupations. They've actually done something good for Britain. I'll just give you one example. There was a gay doctor in Iraq who, after the Iraq War, was targeted for execution by Islamist extremists. I helped him get to Britain. He won asylum. He could have walked into one of London's top teaching hospitals and got a very highly paid job. Instead, he searched around and found that there was an isolated community in northern Scotland that had no GP. They had no GP for 5 years. He said, "That's where I'm going. I want to show the British people how grateful I am that you've granted me refuge." And that guy, that doctor stayed there and gave that community the first doctor they'd had in 5 years. So a lot of refugees are doing really positive things to help Britain.
OK. Phil, on Facebook, the GB News Facebook page, asks, where do you stand on human rights for those who are unvaccinated and will be forbidden from a range of activities in the UK? So Phil obviously referring to government plans to introduce vaccine passports, Peter.
Well, I think that would be a very aggressive step. I mean, we don't want to compel people. We want to educate people and inform people that, first of all, the vaccines are safe, and secondly, they will protect you, and that it's in your interest and the interest of other people around you to have protection. You know, there are many people in our society who have been vaccinated but are still at risk of COVID. You can get COVID more than once, even if you've been vaccinated. You can spread it. And particularly if you work in an occupation where there's vulnerable elderly people, like a care home, it's really important that people are vaccinated, even if they don't want to get vaccinated for themselves, for the sake of the fact that they do not kill the people in that care home. So I would say education and doing the right thing rather than compulsion.
And David, via GB Views, asks, do you think women's rights are being eroded by a fringe minority who claim to be fighting for trans rights, despite many trans people not agreeing with their aims?
Well, I support both women's rights and trans rights, and I don't see a conflict because all women, including trans women, are victims of sexism, domestic violence, hate crime, discrimination, and sexual assault. So that gives all women, including trans women, a common interest in working together. I agree that we need to be very careful about protecting women's safety. I totally get that. But, you know, I know women who work in women's centres that have accepted trans women for many years, for 5 or 6 years, with the agreement of the staff and the women users of the centre. They have never had a problem. There have been a small number of cases where trans women have done bad things. That's true. But they are the exception, not the rule. You know, we do not say that because some people drive cars dangerously, therefore everybody should be banned from driving cars. We base our policy on what most people do, and most trans people do not threaten other women in any way whatsoever. And I think it's very wrong to generalize and demonize them. We should be supporting trans rights while also supporting women's rights.
Pleasure to have you for The Big Question. And the documentary, feature-length documentary, Hating Peter Tatchell, is available to watch now on Netflix, and it is a fascinating watch. Although, don't watch it now. You can watch it after this show. Peter Tatchell, we'll speak again soon. Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.